All right, class, we're going to go over pedigrees. This is normally something that I would do in class with you, but as there is no in class because of COVID, I'm going to make this short video for you to learn how to do it. And so this handout that I'm going to provide to you has all the rules of how to determine if something, what type of disease or inheritance a disease has. And so we're going to start with a few simple rules. If most of the males in the pedigree are affected way more than females, then it's an X-linked disorder. And if it's a 50-50 ratio, then it's autosomal, meaning it's on a chromosome that's not a sex chromosome. So in addition, we need to determine if it's dominant or recessive. So if a disorder is dominant, one of the parents must have the disorder in order for the children to have it. They will display it. And I'm sure you've all heard of people being carriers of diseases or being a carrier a gene. So if the disorder is recessive, then neither the parents can have the disease because they could be heterozygous and they could have a good copy of the allele covering up the diseased copy of the allele. So let's look at this as just kind of a way to orient you with these pedigrees. So in this pedigree, we have a female. Circles are always female. Squares are male. We have a female that has the disease here. And she has 1, 2, 3, 4 offspring. And every one of her offspring has the disease. Now, if we were to look at the mating here, her offspring have kids, so she has grandkids. So the first female here has kids with somebody that doesn't have the disease, but both the children have it. In this case, the male that had the disease marries a female or has kids with a female and have 4 kids, and they don't have it. And then in the other 2 female don't have kids. So this is just to orient you. We're going to get into the rules before we dive into deciding what type of disease this is. So another weird or kind of uncommon disease inheritance pattern is a mitochondrial. So mitochondria have their own genomes, and you'll learn why when we get later into it, but you only inherit your mitochondrial genome from your mother. So that means that your father cannot pass down a disease of mitochondrial gene defects. And so in this case here, we see that the offspring of everyone's mother is passing the disease down, right? So here we have a son where the mom passed it down, and she had 2 kids, a daughter and a son, and they both had it. And then in this case, the female passes it down, and so the grandchild of that original person has it, and she has an offspring, and the daughter has it. However, you'll notice that when in this generation, the son does not pass it down, and in this generation, the son does not pass it down, because that disease is only inherited from your mom. So this is kind of the nitty-gritty, the stuff that is going to be very helpful for you in determining what these diseases are. So we're going to go through these rules of inheritance. And so first here we have the autosomal recessive. So this appears in both sexes with equal frequency, and it tends to skip generations. So it doesn't mean it always skips generations, but it means that it can skip generations. And this means that the disease will appear in some offspring that don't have affected parents, because those parents were both carriers, but the offspring got both the bad alleles or the diseased alleles. And then when both parents are heterozygote, 1/4 of the progeny will be affected, and this is based on your Punnett square that you learned, the single gene Punnett square, where you have 4 quadrants, right? You have a big A, then the 2 heterozygotes, and then a small a, and your chance of being small a is 1/4. So hence why 1/4 of the progeny would be affected. And this, so more frequent among children of consanguine marriages. This means inbreeding. So you always have heard inbreeding's terrible, and genetically that's true. It's because the frequency of these recessive alleles is increased with that. So now let's look at dominant. So dominant appears in both sexes with equal frequency. So it's autosomal. It does not skip a generation. So there's no carriers for dominant. If you have a copy of it, you show the disease. It's not like recessive, where if you show a copy of it, or if you have a copy of it, a dominant allele can suppress it. If you have a copy of a autosomal dominant gene, you will show that phenotype. So affected offspring must have an affected parent unless it's a new mutation, but I'm not going to give you any examples of new mutations. It's really rare. And another rule is that when one parent is affected and the other parent is unaffected, half the offspring will be affected. So because this is like a Punnett square, we have either a big A or a big A small a by a small a, where we get a 1-to-1 ratio. And so this is where you get that 50%. And unaffected parents don't transfer the trait because they don't have a copy of that mutant allele. So X-linked dominant. So both males and females are affected, but often more females are affected than males. And if you think about why this is, so in a dominant trait, you have you just need 1 copy to show the disease. And since females have 2 copies of the X chromosome, that means they're twice as likely to show the trait than males. This also does not skip a generation. The affective sons must have come from affected mothers. And if we think about this with the XY sex chromosomes, the reason for that is because if you're a male, you only get a Y from your dad. You can't get your dad's X. So if you're a male and you have the disease, you had to get that X from your mother. So an affected daughter must have either an affected mother or an affected father. So they can get it from either their mom or their dad. But it's not like recessive, since this is a dominant trait. If a daughter has it and neither of their parents do, then it's not X-linked dominant. Affected fathers will pass the trait to all of their daughters. And if you think of this in the XY context, if you're a daughter, you automatically get your father's X chromosome. So if your father has it and you're a daughter, you have to have it. And affected mothers, if they're heterozygous, will pass the trait on to half of their sons and half of their daughters, because they have a good copy of the X and a bad copy of the X, and you have a 50-50 chance of getting one of those 2 X chromosomes. So X-linked recessive now. In this case, more males have it than females, and that's because males, again, only have 1 X chromosome, and so they don't have a chromosome to cover up that defective gene. Females having 2 X chromosomes can have a dominant copy on one chromosome and a mutated copy on the other, and it will cover up that recessive allele. So if you're a male, you're going to have it if you get the X chromosome. If you're a female, you could have a good copy on the other chromosome to cover it up. Affected sons are usually born to unaffected mothers, so the trait usually skips a generation, like all recessive traits. Approximately half of the carrier's mother's sons are affected, because if a mother has it and you're a son, you have a 50-50 shot, right? Because you get one of those 2 chromosomes from your mom. And it's never passed from a father to son. Why is that? Because of this XY thing again, remember. So if you have a father that has it and you're a son, you never get an X chromosome from your dad if you're a son, only if you're a daughter. You get the Y from your dad if you are a son. So it's never passed from father to son. And then lastly, all daughters of affected fathers are at least carriers for it. So if you're a daughter, you automatically get that affected X, and then it depends on if your mom had it or not. So at the least, you're a carrier. If you also get an affected gene from your mom, then you'll have the disease. So Y-linked dominant, only males are affected because females don't have any Y chromosome. It's passed from fathers to all sons, and it does not skip a generation. That makes sense because it's a dominant gene. And then mitochondrial, we kind of went over. It's inherited only from mothers. And then all children of a mother are at risk to be affected or carriers. All right, so we're going to go over some examples here. Okay, the first example we're going to go over here is an example of X-linked recessive, and our example disease is hemophilia. And so, as you can see from this pedigree, only males are affected, and sons do not share the phenotype with their father because they get that Y chromosome from their father. And because it skips a generation, it's X-linked recessive, not X-linked dominant. So because it's only males, and because they don't get it from their, or because males do not share that with their father, we have X-linked recessive. Our second example is X-linked dominant. It's every generation. It doesn't skip a generation, so we know it's not recessive. And fathers only pass it to daughters, and then the mother passes it to 50% of their sons, right? Passes it to the 50% of their daughters. The next here we have is autosomal recessive. So the X-linked are a little more rare. The autosomal ones are a lot more common. So autosomal recessive, it skips a generation. And this here is an example never mind. Sorry. So autosomal recessive, it skips a generation. And if you have it, and you could get it from unaffected parents. And so in this case, both the square and the circle and this square and the circle, so dad and mom, don't have the genes or the disease, but they were carriers of the recessive disease. And so therefore, their children can get it. So another example of autosomal recessive, see we have parents that don't have the disease, so it skips this generation, but their children do have it. And because it expresses in both sexes at about the same frequency, so because this is not theoretical and it's actual children, it's not, it's kind of, can sometimes be difficult to tell if it is the same frequency or not. In this case, we have 3 sons and 2 daughters, so that's roughly 50%. For it to be one of the X-linked ones where it's like more daughters or more sons, it has to be a stark difference. And here we have another skips generation, so this mother only passed on a copy of the gene, and the dominant gene came from the father, so therefore they all have a dominant copy to cover up that recessive copy. Example 5 here, this is again a dominant, autosomal dominant, where we have each generation has it, and it's equal in males and females. Example 6 here, another example of autosomal dominant, again not skipping a generation, and about equal male and females. In this case, we have Y-linked. So only males can have it because females don't have a Y chromosome. So we have a father that had it, and every one of his sons has to have it because that father always passes that Y chromosome to his sons. And since it is a dominant trait, then they'll always have it. His daughter has kids, but since he didn't pass a Y to his daughter, obviously, otherwise his daughter would be a son, this generation doesn't have it. And this male doesn't have it because this is indicating, mating that from outside the family. Another example of X-linked dominant here doesn't skip, I was saying autosomal dominant, X-linked dominant. So it is in every generation, and daughters of affected males have it, and then half of the offspring from affected mothers should have it. So this one's a little bit tricky in that we see here we have a male that has it, and that his daughters always have it, right? Because they always get an X chromosome from the father. And in this case, we have a female that had it to start with. So 50% of her daughters, or roughly, see, we only have 3, so we can't really have 50%, but 50% of her daughters, 1 out of 3, should have it. And then in this female, 50% of her daughters should have it, but there's only 1. So this one is a bit confusing and hard to tell if it's X-linked dominant or if it's an autosomal. So these type won't be this confusing or this limited of information on what I test you on. But as you can see, if you don't have enough information, then it can be a little tricky to decipher what the answers are. So again, this is a real big pedigree, and it's real easy to spot the autosomal dominant because you see it never skips a generation, right? You can see on every line that there are affected individuals, and that wherever there's an affected individual, one of their parents had to have it. So this is the example of the mitochondrial. And so remember, if your mother has it, then your offspring should have it. So this one is actually not quite correct now that I'm looking at it, because this daughter should have it as well. The father doesn't pass it along, so as you can see here, imagine that this is colored in black. I got these from a source, and so I'm not responsible for creating these. But as you can see here, if the mother has it, then the offspring have it. And so this should be black as well. And these should be black. But then if the father has it, the offspring do not get it passed down, because you only get your mitochondria from your mother. So here's an example of recessive. An individual, autosomal recessive, an individual has the disease and the parents did not. This is an example of inbreeding here. So you can see that this would be 2 cousins that ended up having kids together, and that increases the chance of recessive alleles expressing because there are more carriers within a family than outside the family. There's not really, that's a good piece of knowledge to know, but it's kind of hard to decipher from pedigrees unless you actually have evidence of this inbreeding. So here is an example. This is a better example of mitochondrial inheritance. The last one, ignore example 10. I don't know why that one was labeled that. But so we have a mother who has an affected daughter. The daughter obviously is going to pass it down to her kids. So all 3 of her sons have it. She has another daughter, and her 2 daughters and son have it. She has a son that has it, but because the son does not pass down the inheritance to his children, because mitochondria only come from your mother, then his children are unaffected. Another example of dominant, you should be able to spot these pretty easily now. Just looking at it, it doesn't skip a generation, about equal 50-50 male and female, and every affected individual has an affected parent. This one is another example of mitochondrial, another good example. Ignore example 10, like I said. Mitochondrial inheritance, we have a female, all of their offspring have it. Her daughter passes it down to all of her offspring, but her son passed it down to none of her offspring. In this example, we have X-linked recessive. So in this case, males have it more often, right? Because you only have one X chromosome. And so if you have a copy, there's no second X chromosome to cover it up. So we see here that we have two individuals that show the disease. And anytime there is a spot inside of this shape, the circle or the square, that means that we know they have the gene, but they don't express it. So they're carriers. So in this case, this father had two offspring that were carriers, and one of them had kids and had a carrier child, a carrier daughter. And remember, if it's X-linked recessive, daughters are most likely to be carriers, but less likely to show the disease because they need two copies. But males will always show the disease if they receive a copy of that copy from their carrier mother, right? And you'll never see a father pass an X-linked recessive to their son because they only get Ys from their sons. So in this case, we have, it's kind of hard to see back here. Again, this is, if it's this is another annotation of a carrier, either the circle inside or a half circle. So you have a carrier mother who has a son that has it and a daughter that's a carrier. The daughter has two sons that have it, and then this guy has a daughter that is a carrier, and then a grandchild that has it. So in this case, since not every generation has it, it skips generations. Even though it skips this generation, we have a little more information that shows that that she's a carrier, but it still would be considered skipped if it's a carrier. Just no showing of the disease. So we know that it's recessive because it skips a generation, and then the affected dads make carrier families, which is this case right here, and but it's also can be transmitted through the mother, and only males are affected, and sons do not share the phenotype with their father, thus it's X-linked. And that is it for this. So there'll be some examples of this on the quiz for you to go through. There are examples in the book as well if you want to try your hand at identifying these types of or these pedigrees for the exam.